Welcome back. This is the team of Palawi, Francis, Asha, Jabril, and Elsie. And they are talking about housing. The sponsor is the Federal Housing Advocate. And you'll see the challenge there. How can Canada better fulfill its obligations to ensure the right to adequate housing for resettled refugees and asylum claimants in Canada? Great issue. Take it away, folks. Good luck.
Thank you.
Should we wait for time? Okay. Canada is grappling with a severe housing crisis shaped by unaffordability, lack of housing stock, and decades-long disinvestments in social housing. Of all of the OECD countries, Canada has the lowest proportion of subsidized rental units. Amidst this crisis lies the urgent and unaddressed issue of housing insecurity among refugees and refugee claimants. Every year, millions of people are pushed out of their homes by war and persecution, exercising their human right to seek refuge in safer lands. Canada is a global leader in refugee resettlement, welcoming a significant number of refugees and claimants each year. But increasingly, these individuals experience the violence of displacement only to arrive and experience housing insecurity and inadequacy, a violation of another right. At all levels of government, billions of dollars have been spent to address this issue, but current interventions do not even begin to address the root of the problem. Today, our team, Asha, Jabril, Francis, Pallavi, and myself will answer the following question tasked by the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate. How can Canada better fulfill its obligations to ensure the right to adequate housing for resettled refugees and refugee claimants in Canada? To answer this question, we will give an overview of the context, followed by the current policy landscape, which is ever-changing, before diving into what it means to take a human rights-based approach to housing. We'll then discuss our key findings, which were gained over a review of the literature and consultation with over 40 subject matter experts. We'll then present our recommendations and discuss how our recommendations fit into a phased approach towards the progressive realization of the right to adequate housing. Finally, we'll describe a bit of costing details, conclude, and move to questions. The right to adequate housing is enshrined in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which Canada became a state party to over half a century ago. This means that Canada has a legal obligation to advance towards the fulfillment of this right. This right is not just about a roof over one's head. It includes safe and affordable housing where people can live with dignity. Despite this right, millions of people in Canada, especially refugees and claimants, face housing insecurity and inadequacy. Canada's refugee protection regime is made up of two main categories: the Refugee and Humanitarian Resettlement Program, which has 3 subcategories, and those are folks who are granted protection outside of Canada, and the In-Canada Asylum Program, which is the human right to claim asylum once you arrive to Canada's borders. We make this distinction because the categories determine what kind of supports and services that the refugees are eligible upon arrival, and this has direct implications for long-term housing security. In recent years, Canada has continued to resettle among the highest rates of resettled refugees relative to its population globally. This is especially true in recent years, where Canada has resettled over almost 300,000 refugees, including a significant number of Ukrainian refugees displaced by the conflict led by Russia. Additionally, Canada has seen a huge spike in the volume of refugee claimants arriving to its borders. Last year alone, it welcomed nearly 150,000 refugee claimants. However, receiving refugees and refugee claimants is only the first step. Upon arrival, many refugees and claimants face the realities of housing inadequacy. This reality began to hit a crisis in 2017 when numbers of claimants more than doubled in just 1 year. The glaring gaps in the reception for claimants was then exposed. Thousands of refugee claimants who arrived with housing precarity were forced to rely on emergency shelters. And when these shelters filled up, many families, including children, were forced to sleep on the streets. Canada has long prided itself in being a safe haven for those fleeing persecution. But it is failing to fulfill its obligations to refugees when it does not ensure adequate housing. This is not just a policy issue. It is a human rights violation. Next, Jabril will discuss the current policy landscape to address these urgent needs.
Thank you, Elsie. Ensuring the right to adequate housing for refugees and refugee claimants will require an all-of-government and all-governments approach. This is an issue that sits squarely at the domain of two major policy intersections: housing and immigration. We do want to note that the National Housing Strategy Act recognized the right to housing in Canadian law and reaffirmed our international obligations. It also created the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate. The responsibility of housing and homelessness policy falls under Infrastructure Canada. However, we do want to note that this responsibility has changed over time. With the passing of Bill C-59 just last week on June 20th, Infrastructure Canada is now called the Department of Housing, Infrastructures, and Communities Canada. Under that, we have the National Housing Strategy, an $82 billion plus 10-year program to give more people in Canada a place to call home. As well, the Reaching Home strategy is aimed at preventing and reducing homelessness across Canada. On immigration policy, the Immigration, Refugee, and Protection Act, IRPA, reaffirmed our human rights obligations to refugees and refugee claimants. The Department of Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, IRCC, oversees Canada's immigration, refugee protection, and citizenship services. They administer a suite of resettlement programs for resettled refugees and claimants, which you can see on the slide. At the heart of all of this, we have civil society organizations. Civil society actors are at the forefront of service delivery for resettled refugees and refugee claimants. They're often excluded from federal funding, although they may be funded by provinces and territories, as well as municipalities. We give this overview of the crucial policy landscape because it is crucial to understand what the current approaches are and where we are falling short. Housing is a sphere where a human rights-based approach, an HRBA, is essential. And HRBA seeks to operationalize programs and policies in a way that is consistent with human rights law, including the principles of disaggregated data, non-discrimination, substantive equality, meaningful participation, accountability, and monitoring. The concept of adequate housing comes from the United Nations and the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, which was mentioned earlier. It informs the National Housing Strategy Act and Canadian law. But before we get any further, you might be wondering what housing adequacy means. It is defined and measured by the following criteria: the security of tenure, the availability of services, affordability, habitability, accessibility, the location, and cultural adequacy. Here is where the right to adequate housing looks different from other kinds of rights. Instead of guaranteeing an immediate result, the principle of progressive realization requires that governments take deliberate steps using the maximum available resources towards the full realization of the right to housing. Next, we will discuss our key findings and where our stakeholder engagement and interviews have left us. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Jabril. We've grouped our key findings into two categories. The first four cover the government's response to the ongoing crisis, and the last three cover systemic barriers to housing adequacy. Our central finding is that there is no national plan to meet the core housing needs of refugee claimants. This is in stark contrast with Canada's programs for resettled refugees and other priority populations, resulting in disparate impacts for claimants. Secondly, in our research, it has become evident that there is a total lack of understanding of the housing precarity experienced by refugees and claimants. This is due to the absence of standardized approaches to measure the housing outcomes of refugees and claimants across provinces. One of the drivers of the previous findings is rooted in the fact that housing and immigration fall under shared jurisdiction. This has resulted in an absence of ownership across all levels of government and all governments to fulfill the right to adequate housing for refugees and especially claimants. This leads us to our fourth finding, that since there is no clear ownership of the issue, current approaches are piecemeal. Further, existing programs to temporarily house refugee claimants are short-sighted, costly, and unsustainable. Next to Francis to overview our housing-related key findings.
Thank you, Asha. We learned that long-term housing security is best achieved through wraparound supports. Services such as housing accompaniment, language training, and psychosocial support for refugees and refugee claimants are essential for their successful resettlement and integration into the community. Our analysis shows that the financialization of housing in Canada has pushed refugees and refugee claimants into the unaffordable private rental market, thus increasing their risk of housing insecurity. We also found that refugees and refugee claimants are disproportionately vulnerable to discrimination. We also found that refugees and refugee claimants are disproportionately vulnerable to systemic discrimination based on their race, religion, immigration status, and even family size, posing increased challenges in securing adequate housing. Together, these findings show the systemic and structural barriers that refugees and refugee claimants face in accessing adequate housing. With this in mind, we developed 4 core policy objectives and a set of recommendations, which we will discuss next, beginning with the first objective.
Thank you, Francis. Our first objective is National Plan for Reception of Refugee Claimants, with the federal government taking primary ownership. Canada's lack of a national framework means that refugee claimants arriving with housing needs, the default is homelessness. This articulation was emphasized by various subject matter experts and perfectly encapsulated why Canada needs a national plan to prevent a homelessness crisis among this priority population. Thus, we recommend the federal government take the lead in developing a national plan for the reception of claimants. The main component of this national plan must be the establishment of national reception centers in major census metropolitan areas across Canada under National Housing Strategy. The primary objective is to offer temporary housing, typically from 1 to 3 months, and thorough support services throughout their processing of their application. National Reception Center will provide a sustainable model and standardized service delivery across provinces and territories. Federal government should take the lead in establishing a funding source under the Rapid Housing Stream, which is a funding source under National Housing Strategy, offering low interest or forgivable loans with operational costs shared by all levels of the government. Our key findings indicated that while Canada has targeted approach for resettled refugees, there is a glaring lack of targeted and integrated approach for refugee claimants, which leads to desperate housing outcomes for this priority population. Our stakeholder consultation consistently highlighted this gap, highlighting the urgent need for a national plan. Currently, we do have a reception plan in the province of Quebec, which is called the Regional Program for Settlement and Integration of Asylum Seekers, called PRADA, which is a centralized reception center for all claimants within the province. Our recommended national reception plan, inspired by PRADA model and also other reception model which has been tried and tested in jurisdictions like Germany and Finland, provides a compelling approach to claimant resettlement. Existing literature and consultations further indicate that the period immediately following the claimant's arrival is marked by high levels of housing precarity. During this critical period, our proposed National Reception Center will create a welcoming, culturally sensitive, and trauma-informed setting, offering temporary housing from 1 to 3 months and initial settlement support to facilitate successful integration into communities. Our key findings further indicate that providing this wrap-around supports is a crucial factor in achieving long-term settlement, thereby meeting the criteria for adequate housing. When considering the implementation of National Reception Center, it is evident from extensive stakeholder consultation that effective interjurisdictional collaboration is a crucial factor to fulfill Canada's housing obligation for refugees. To support the national plan, we recommend amending bilateral agreements under National Housing Strategy to define cost sharing, designate clear responsibilities among all government levels, and establish coordination channels, starting with the pilot phase before full-scale implementation. These efforts also include increasing engagement by provincial and municipal governments. A key emphasis throughout this recommendation is that to replace the current fragmented emergency response with sustainable solution and ensure consistent respect for rights across Canada. Moreover, this approach will improve data monitoring capabilities and enable more targeted policy development. National Reception Center must, however, maintain flexibility to adapt to potential fluctuation in refugee claimant numbers, thereby reducing the risk of underutilization during the periods of lower arrivals. These considerations are not only practical necessities, but also foundational elements to ensure efficiency and sustainability of our proposed model. Thank you.
Thank you, Pallavi. Objective 2 is about redirecting existing interim funding schemes towards models that are more sustainable, more cost-effective, and have greater demonstrated success in facilitating long-term housing security among the communities that they serve. As outlined in Objective 1, Canada will only be able to meaningfully address the emerging housing crisis among claimants once the national reception centers are established across the country. However, this won't happen overnight. And in the meanwhile, thousands of claimants will continue to arrive monthly facing unmet housing needs. Additionally, resettled refugees may still experience housing insecurity due to the broader unaffordability landscape and the inadequacy of current supports. Thus, Recommendation 2 is about interim solutions. The main recommendation under Objective 2 is to reallocate existing funds to scale up the capacity of community shelters and civil society shelters that have demonstrated success in meeting the housing needs of refugees and refugee claimants. Currently, federal programs like the Interim Housing Assistance Program, IHAP, and the Interim Lodging Service, ILS, lack sustainability and cost effectiveness. IHAP, for example, works by reimbursing provinces and municipalities for emergency shelter costs, stepping up to cost share some of the burden of this emergency. However, this funding is limited to temporary accommodations like hotels and emergency city shelters. Additionally, in recent years, IRCC, through the ILS, rents thousands of rooms at any given time to meet hotel rooms at any given time to meet the urgent housing needs of refugee claimants across the country. At present, our last research indicated that ILS is currently renting 4,000 rooms, housing approximately 7,300 claimants, with each room costing $5,000 to $6,000 per room per month. Just since 2017, IHAP and ILS spending is set to exceed $1.5 billion, as recent annual top-ups have exceeded $200 million for each program respectively. These high costs do not advance the long-term housing security of refugee claimants or refugees. Thus, the main sub-recommendation in this objective is to revise the terms and conditions of existing programs, such as IHAP and ILS, to expand the eligibility of who can access these funds and provide these services. This change addresses the inflexibility and limited scope of current programs, allowing for a broader range of support and more sustainable housing solutions. Additionally, the programs we just mentioned almost exclusively offer only shelter and basic nutrition needs at these very high monthly costs. In contrast, community and civil society shelters offer a suite of essential wraparound services that actually facilitate long-term housing security and better integration into the country. This is why organizations like the Refugee Center here in Quebec and Matthew House Ottawa have demonstrated stronger settlement outcome. But these organizations lack the funding and support to scale their operations. These shelters operate at a fraction of the cost of hotels and emergency accommodations through ILS and IHAP, with estimated monthly costs ranging from $800 to $1,200 per bed, inclusive of basic needs and the essential wraparound services, including legal assistance, language courses, mental health support, accompaniment on the housing search, and many more. Thus, our sub-recommendation is to ensure that the redirection of federal funds supports an expansion in terms of what kind of services can be provided and funded. Redirecting funds is a strategic investment that aligns with Canada's refugee obligations and will optimize existing spending to enhance fiscal management and make sure that the housing solutions are sustainable. This is also in line with the legal obligation to maximize the amount of resources allocated toward ensuring adequate housing solutions. By investing in these initiatives, Canada can provide immediate housing solutions. These can be guided by a partnerships framework and tight accountability and oversight guidelines to ensure that what we're doing works. This will build the long-term capacity and ultimately ensure a more responsive housing support system, better prepared to meet the housing needs of today and in the future as claimant and refugee arrivals continue to ebb and flow, even once we have a national plan in place. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Elsie. Interviews with civil society organizations reveal service delivery gaps within Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, which leave resettled refugees and especially claimants disproportionately vulnerable to homelessness. Gaps include insufficient shelter allowances, barriers to accessing resettlement programs, and administrative delays in receiving essential documentation. Our recommendations under Objective 3 are rooted in the belief that optimizing the IRCC's service delivery capacity will function as a homelessness prevention mechanism. If adopted, it can boon downstream effects which mitigate against the devastating impacts of housing precarity. There are two core components of the IRCC's Resettlement Assistance Program, which is currently restricted to resettled refugees: the provision of monthly income supports and the provision of settlement services. Evidence based on market data indicate that these monthly shelter allowances are incompatible with market rent. When we compared shelter allowances for a 4-person family with the going rent of a 2-bedroom apartment in each province, we found that rent exceeded RAP shelter allowances 3 times over. Lack of adequate income supports for resettled refugees often push them into a smaller submarket of private rentals, where landlords often exploit their limited resources by neglecting maintenance or violating housing codes. Our solution is to have the IRCC leverage the expertise of CMHC to appropriately index RAP shelter allowances with rent. This will enable resettled refugees to obtain shelter which meets the criteria for housing adequacy, including affordability, habitability, and security of tenure. Secondly, as mentioned in our key findings, interviews with civil society organizations reveal that claimants are disproportionately vulnerable to discrimination within the private rental market. Under the RAP, the Resettlement Assistance Program, service provider organizations offer accompaniment in the housing search, leveraging interpersonal relationships with landlords to buffer against potential discrimination. The RAP has the infrastructure, funding, and expertise to provide core assistance to claimants. Extending its eligibility would require limited startup costs, operational planning, and would be more efficient overall. If the eligibility of settlement services offered under the Resettlement Assistance Program were extended to claimants, it would position them to understand their rights as tenants, insulate them from discrimination, and secure adequate housing. Lastly, due to an unprecedented increase in arrivals, claim decisions that previously took 6 months now take up to 3 years. This leaves claimants in an administrative limbo, unable to work, unable to access federal services, and often unable to obtain a lease due to their immigration status. This was echoed during interviews with settlement organizations, which revealed intersecting administrative challenges claimants experience once they exit temporary accommodations. Expediting documentation processing can reduce the length of time claimants require social assistance or emergency housing. More importantly, it can trigger essential steps, such as opening a bank account, applying for a job, and obtaining a lease. Thank you.
Thanks, Asha. And as previously mentioned by her, our key findings showed that there is an absence of a standardized approach to data collection to measure the homelessness experienced by resettled refugees and claimants in Canada. Our fourth objective is to adopt a human rights-based approach in HRBA to data collection to gather, monitor, and anticipate the housing needs of refugees and claimants. Good data makes good policy, and you cannot manage what you do not measure. Data is at the core of all of our policy recommendations. Stakeholders have mentioned that Canada's data collection schemes are fragmented and siloed between government departments. Some collect disaggregated data on refugees and refugee claimants, while others do not. To both Infrastructure Canada and Statistics Canada's credit, they have begun including this data in their point-in-time counts for homelessness and some other surveys, but more needs to be done. This is why a more robust approach is needed. By adopting an HRBA to data, it will allow the Federal Housing Advocate to fulfill their mandate to monitor our progress towards realizing the right to housing. It would allow for data-driven policy decisions. It would also allow for proactive policy planning instead of Canada's current reactive approach. The federal government should partner with provinces and territories to adopt these principles and to collect disaggregated data for these priority populations. This could be done through National Housing Strategy bilateral agreements. Given the vulnerabilities that refugees and claimants face due to factors that we have previously mentioned, it is important to adopt a HRBA approach to data to ensure that their needs are met and that their rights are upheld. Secondly, we recommend integrating the data of refugees and refugee claimants living in shelters and transitional housing within the Homelessness, Individuals, and Families Information Systems, or HIFIS, and national shelter surveys. These data systems provide real-time information on the people experiencing homelessness, including the number of shelter beds that are available. They allow civil society to coordinate services, and these systems are implemented in collaboration with provinces and territories through these bilateral agreements. However, refugees and claimants do get tagged as newcomers in emergency shelters rather than a group with distinct needs. Civil society has stated that this causes difficulties in coordinating numbers and leads to an underreporting of the data and the true numbers of individuals staying within their shelters. We do want to reiterate that shelters should continue to be low barrier, and immigration status should not impede access. Finally, we want to empower civil society organizations to track the long-term housing outcomes of refugees and claimants through the National Housing Strategy Research and Planning Fund. We need to continue a programmatic and policy shift that explicitly recognizes refugees and refugee claimants in housing policy. By dedicating a stream explicitly for these priority populations, we can begin collecting relevant information on their long-term housing outcomes. Civil society, with their direct interface with refugees and claimants, can gather more accurate data on their housing needs, which the government could leverage. One example is the Immigrant and Refugee Community of Manitoba, IRCOM. They partner with Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation and academics to study the long-term impacts of transitional housing. This empirical study provided a rich evidence base. There are considerations that do need to be taken into account. Civil societies may only speak to one household member, the English-speaking male, thereby overlooking the experiences of gender diverse individuals and women. Capturing gender-specific data is crucial for accurately reflecting their experiences. Data will allow the FHA to effectively track our progress towards the progressive realization of the right to housing and monitor long-term housing outcomes.
Thank you, Jibril. As discussed by my colleagues, our recommendations focus on meeting the urgent housing needs of refugee claimants upon their arrival. This is in line with human rights principles, which seek to first target and prioritize those in greatest need. One important principle in this approach to housing is progressive realization. We see our recommendations as part of a larger effort where the government continues to invest in and change housing policies at all levels. Since the housing issues that refugees and refugee claimants face are part of Canada's broader housing crisis, it is clear that moving towards adequate housing for these priority groups will require action at all levels. Government action is needed to build up the transitional housing infrastructure, invest in housing starts, strengthen rental protection, social housing, and other permanent housing initiatives. This is an overview of how our recommendations fit into the phased approach. As you can see, recommendation 1, which is to establish national reception centers, is the central component of addressing phase 1. In the interim, while this is being developed, recommendation 2 suggests that more effective spending on temporary programs by scaling up the capacity of refugee-serving emergency shelters. Recommendation 3, which involves indexing, improving and optimizing processes that impact refugees and refugee claimants' access to housing, spans all phases. Finally, recommendation 4, which is improved data collection, needs to begin immediately and maintained throughout. This recommendation will empower the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate to better monitor Canada's progress toward the progressive realization of the right to adequate housing. Next, we will look at the cost consideration.
Thank you, Francis. Coming to costing to recommendation, National Reception Center, as outlined in Recommendation 1, are projected to cost about $35,000 per claimant for 3-month stay and a year support services in CMA Toronto. In comparison, addressing homelessness cost around $75,000 for those with higher needs. For Recommendation 2, total cost for 8,000 bed in community-based shelter would cost around $95 million, inclusive of shelter and support services, while the same number of beds under interim lodging services, which is currently being provided by IRCC, would average is costing around $264 million. Moving to our Recommendation 3, indexing monthly shelter allowances to approximately 60% of market rent will cost an additional $147 million annually, whereas expanding settlement services for approximately 60,000 claimants will cost around $207 million. While these numbers may appear high, it is important to note that IRCC mobilized over $390 million solely to provide income support for Ukrainian newcomers last year. For our last recommendation, we recognize that incorporating existing data into national survey would require minimum cost and would be reallocation of existing fund under National Housing Strategy. Overall, we are simply optimizing what is already available to achieve better results.
Thank you, Pallavi. Ensuring housing security for resettled refugees and claimants is a complex issue, intertwined with Canada's housing crisis. Current government investments to increase the housing supply do not address the determinants of housing precarity for this priority population. Our proposed measures to seek not only to provide immediate relief, but prevent future housing insecurity through a human rights-based approach. Implementing these recommendations will yield wide-ranging benefits, including improved trust in Canada's refugee and housing systems through a more cost-effective and sustainable approach. The Federal Housing Advocate can play a pivotal role in this process by leveraging insights from our report and presenting them to the Minister of Housing, who is required to respond within 120 days. By taking these steps, Canada can truly honor its commitment to providing not just refuge, but a secure and dignified home for all who seek safety in its borders. And with that, we're happy to move to our jury panel and audience for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, team. All right, judges, who's up? Tim?
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks very much. That was a very good presentation. I guess running through the presentation, there's kind of a tension between the sort of compelling argument that there's a human rights for a human rights-based approach, there's a legal obligation to provide adequate housing, vis-a-vis the economic reality that we have generally a scarcity of housing in Canada, and the political reality that this is something that requires action by not just one federal ministry, and certainly not just by the FHA, but by the federal government, but also by the provincial and municipal governments, and the fact that anything that ensures adequate housing for refugees is likely to imply putting other people who may be short of housing further down the list of priorities, and some of those people may be people who can vote in Canada. So sort of wondered, I mean, what could, given that that's the case that you're making, that the refugees do have a legal right to this housing, and over and above others who might not have housing, then how are you going to make that case, or how are you suggesting the FHA drive that through to these other levels of government that need to collaborate? I mean, is it a matter of taking everybody to court and asserting the legal right, or are there ways you can persuade them that they need to readjust the priority? Thanks.
Thank you so much for that question. It is a very important question, and it's not necessarily that we're prioritizing one group over another. Currently, many refugees and refugee claimants are not eligible for social housing, and all of our recommendations fall within the backdrop of the greater unaffordability crisis in housing in Canada. So what we're recommending are cost-effective measures. As we mentioned, the cost of actually preventing homelessness, or the cost of homelessness, is $51,000, and those with greater needs is $75,000. Whereas if we take care of it upstream and provide them with adequate shelter once they arrive to Canada, it could ultimately lead to cost savings in the future. And going back to the legal obligations, I can only speak at the federal level, and we can only speak at the federal level. We had signed on to the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights over half a century ago. We have recognized that under Section 4 within our housing policy that the right to adequate housing exists. And going back to the topic of progressive realization, we require that we take the maximum available resources to address the issue. And currently we see the cost that this is having on our cities, where a lot of emergency shelters are being full, are over capacity, and are not able to take in more people in their shelters. We heard in our stakeholder engagement with shelters in Ottawa that upwards of 50% of their shelters are filled with refugee claimants. And again, it goes back to our recommendations on data monitoring, where we just don't know the true numbers and the scale of the issue. So if we address the issue solely focusing on refugees and claimants, then it would alleviate pressure on the shelter system and ultimately lead to greater outcomes.
Thank you for that presentation. This is obviously an important issue. I had a very similar question as Tim. So the picture you showed earlier in Toronto, when that was happening, I saw refugees sleeping on the streets, so very aware of that. But I think one of the things that I saw in Canada was the sentiment towards refugees and immigration has changed quite dramatically. And instead of advocating for more housing, there was a lot of conversation about, send these folks home, why are they here? And so I guess one question is, how would you kind of recommend dealing with that growing sentiment to what Tim was saying, that housing costs are extremely high? Why would you prioritize refugees and bring them to this country when people like you and I can't afford housing? But the other question I would have is, how do you ensure there's no backsliding by the levels of government, right? In the Toronto situation, the Prime Minister was telling the Premier, this is your province, pointing up some money. The Premier is telling the Prime Minister, you control borders, you control refugees, why are you bringing them here if you can't afford it? And the mayor is telling both levels of government, we have no money, someone needs to figure this out. So how do you ensure that, one level of government doesn't take all the burden, given that nobody wants to pony up money, because this is I would view it as not a major priority to these folks, given what's happening to a lot of folks in Canada right now.
Thank you for that question. When we started our research, that was one of the biggest things on our mind, right? Is the political will, the growing backdrop of xenophobia or just anti-newcomer sentiment in general. And one of the things that we kind of came across time and time again is that focusing on the scapegoating that is happening is kind of a surface level analysis, versus pushing the government to address not just the specific housing challenges of this group, but the broader structural housing challenges in Canada, the broader unaffordability crisis, the broader financialization of housing, to undo the decades-long disinvestments in social housing is actually the best way to address that, right? Because refugees and refugee claimants are being scapegoated for what is actually housing issues that are much deeper and much more layered than what it appears to be on the surface. A growth in population by a couple 100,000 people per year would not overburden a system that is made to adapt and made to meet the housing demands of the population. And to Canada's credit, the municipalities and the provinces stepped up quite quickly. As we showed in 2017, you had a jump of over double, right? Before 2015, for many years, you were seeing less than 20,000 claimants per year. At times, there were more resettled refugees, yes, but claimants, in terms of unexpected arrivals, you really never saw more than 20,000 until 2017, when you suddenly saw 50,000. And now, last year, 140,000, upwards of that. So Canada, in a lot of ways, has been insulated from these unexpected arrivals, right? It's surrounded by two rivers, U.S. to the south, two oceans, the U.S. to the south. But that day of kind of being protected from the unexpectedness of mass arrivals of displaced people is unfortunately a fiction of the past. It's not our reality. And Canada can either choose to continue to respond to this new reality of the increased levels of displacement and prepare for it and meet it in a more cost-effective, sustainable manner that not only fulfills legal obligations and human rights obligations, but also ensures that systems aren't overburdened, or it can continue to kind of allow the scapegoating to shape the narrative and prevent it from taking the necessary actions to really respond to this in a really structural and meaningful way. Thank you.
Yes. So on the backsliding, if you see all of our recommendation, we are mentioning to amend the bilateral agreement where the clear responsibilities are divided among all the levels of government. Now, currently what's happening is things are not clear, and that's why that backsliding is happening, like where the mayor will say, we don't have money. If you see Peel region, they are also they have almost proposed a reception model. They have the model ready, but they're saying we need more money. But those things have not been clearly delineated in any of these agreements, and that's what we're proposing. Whatever our plan, whether it's a national plan or more money to the civil society, there should be a clear delineation how the money will flow, who will be responsible for the operational cost. Like all the responsibility should be divided among the levels of government. That's it. Thank you.
Huge issue, so thank you very much for all your work that you've done on this. So great presentation. I want to ask about the disconnect with the overall housing challenge that we have. But first, if I can just make a recommendation, I don't think most people really intuitively understand the difference between settled refugees and refugee claimants. And I think so when you're doing this, other times it would be helpful to say, settled refugees are the ones who have in fact been invited to come to Canada, and refugee claimants are, and this is going to sound awful, but they're the ones who come uninvited and then claim once they're here. And I think there's a real psychological prejudice against, in particular, the refugee claimants. And so I think talking a little bit about some of the, when you're trying to enact policies or get decision makers to make policies, don't forget that there are going to be some really tough attitudes, because an awful lot of people do not welcome people coming and claiming status after claiming for asylum. So it's a bit of advice, make that point clearer up front so people understand, and the fact that the claimants do not get the supports, the financial and other supports. You did touch on it, but I think setting the stage is important. On the adequate housing, there are an awful lot of people who don't have anything close to what you've described as adequate housing. This is a massively bigger problem for an awful lot of Canadians and new Canadians. When you talk about reception centres, I'm intrigued by that, because without them, people just end up on the streets. But we run into the problem of people saying, well, but they need adequate housing, right? It's not okay to have a couple of hundred people living on cots in gymnasiums. But my question is, would you be prepared to recommend reception centers that were in fact that kind of much more bulk, at least you're providing a roof and minimal services? That there's a psychological problem here too. Mm-hmm. Would you be prepared in saying these national reception centers need to actually accommodate an awful lot of people when we don't have space necessarily?
Thank you for the question. Our proposed national reception center took a lot of inputs from the German model, and we understand that that model is not perfect. Now, coming to what we are proposing is not like a gymnasium kind of thing where a lot of people with beds will be staying, but more of it's not like, let's say our costing is more on the 1,500 claimants per month. And that will include 4 sites. It's not only one site. So it's not like in a bulk we are putting up a lot of people in one space, but we are creating adequate housing for them with respect to food, with respect to bed, and also like how they are going to stay. So it's not like we are putting all people in a big room, and obviously that will not fulfill the criteria of adequate housing. What we are proposing is number of sites which federal government and provincial government has to work on so that all the criteria of adequate housing is met. But then obviously it will be progressively realized. It will not be realized in a day or a year, but with time. That's it. Thank you.
And just to add to that, in our brief, we talk about the scalability. So obviously, with refugee claimants, we can't always predict how many will come in any month. However, in our report and in the 2024 federal budget, there were proposals for the use of federal properties in provinces and municipalities that could be repurposed for housing. So what we were thinking is allowing that scalability, ensuring that the right to adequate housing is enshrined and carried through when we scale up those shelter options, and using federal buildings, repurposing them in a way that we can accommodate a large rise in the increase of claimants, and then scale down, say, if in the next month or the next few months that decreases. So really the scalability and making sure it's a dynamic process depending on how many claimants arrive in any given month. Thank you.
This is such a huge issue, and it's run, housing and immigration have run, right through the whole time that we've been talking. So thanks so much for your part in kind of addressing this issue. One of the goals of this assignment, though, is to try and find ways to fund things that you're recommending. So they're meant to be, the assignment is meant to be kind of cost neutral. And that generally doesn't mean if you spend money today, you can save money later. So it doesn't, it really requires figuring out what we're not going to do today that we will carry on from here. And so my question is around, I know this is not where you want to go, but did you find opportunities for kind of where money can be reallocated currently? Because in my, when I'm in my day-to-day work, every community serving organization that I know is just working flat out. And many more of them are currently dedicating their resources to the most vulnerable populations. So a lot of reprioritization has already happened. But do you see some scope, even though it might not be huge dollars, do you see some scope for suggestions and recommendations along those lines?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. So one of the biggest things we found in our research is we were just absolutely shocked at how much is currently being spent to address this issue in the really reactive ways, right? And it's kind of to credit to several levels of government across Canada that have responded to this need that's arrived really suddenly. But as we mentioned, since 2017, the programs that were meant to be temporary back then, the Interim Housing Assistance Program, IHAP, and the Interim Lodging Service, which is a repurposed program that's been around kind of for a while, those are meant to be temporary programs. And instead, they just keep getting expanded and more swollen. So with the top-ups that were announced at the end of last year and beginning of this year, by 2024, spending for only those two programs, let alone the spending on health, let alone spending on other programs, is set to exceed $1.5 billion. So our recommendations, the ones for interim solutions, the ones for the long-term solutions, are not meant to complement those or be in addition to those. We're saying here's a more cost-effective way to do it that it also has better outcomes. So it's in place of. Canada is already spending this money, and it's a lot of money. What we're saying with these recommendations is that they can spend that money in more efficient ways, maximize a greater number of resources at a lower dollar amount while being better aligned with human rights standards. And so while, of course, addressing a problem this big is never going to be cost neutral. It's going to require some investments. The investments that we're proposing are less than the investments that are currently being input today.
Okay, thank you. We've got 10 minutes left. It's time to turn to sponsors. I think Maya from the FHA is in the room. Right here. Yes, yes, thank you. Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. I think my colleagues are on the line as well. Marija Zeul, the Federal Housing Advocate, and my colleague, Paula Vasquez. And they are in Ottawa virtually. So yeah, this has been a wonderful collaboration. Thank you so much, students. You're just incredible. And it's been a great journey with you, and appreciate you, Pearl, as well, your legal expertise on this. I did have a couple of comments. Interesting to hear from the panel around human rights-based approach and the political and economic realities. Is it a matter of taking people to court or another approach? I mean, the reality is that Canada has a humanitarian obligation to receive refugees. It's easy to look at refugees as taking away from others. But as the team said, there's disinvestments in housing and systemic issues like the financialization of purpose-built rental housing, which has eroded low end of market housing for this population and many other low-income people who can't access housing now because of it. The Federal Housing Advocate does have a mandate to review systemic issues, and so does the National Housing Council. So these are new access to justice mechanisms that can be used rather than sort of a court system. So that's part of this process, is looking at these systemic issues. In terms of seeing refugees not really a priority, they really should be. This is predictable global reality that we're facing. We've got increased flows due to climate crisis, increased conflicts globally. You know, countries like Bangladesh are receiving, millions of people. So comparatively, we're not receiving as many. And we are a country that has some resources to be able to house people. In terms of looking at refugees sort of with a deficit lens, I don't really find that helpful. We really need to provide people with housing and supports in terms of their long-term integration. Canada needs people. We need people for the labor market, and so there's a lot of potential with refugees coming. They come with all kinds of skills and expertise and knowledge. Some are judges, So we're seeing a lot of very high potential there, and I think that investing in that potential is worth it. So those are just a few comments I had in terms of the panel, but I have another couple of comments, just a second. So this is a complex topic and highly politicized. You did a great job at looking deeper at the systemic issues at play in terms of the right to housing for refugees and refugee claimants. The Federal Housing Advocate recommends a whole of government approach, an intersectional approach to policy, and you did manage to bring together these two typically siloed areas, which has only recently, I think, being started to integrate more and people looking at it more closely together in terms of policy development. And strong policy always comes from meaningful engagement. And while you weren't able to engage directly with rights holders, you spoke with civil society and service provider organizations as well as government officials and synthesized and amplified their voices, which was great. And in terms of policy advocacy, this is important because it takes all people at all levels working together, really rooted in the community realities and aligning with the advocacy community as much as possible. So I look forward to continuing conversation with you and seeing where you go with this. It's wonderful. I do have a question for you. So looking back at the beginning of the project compared to what you've finalized, was there something you found in the research or in your interviews where you felt your understanding of the policy development process was deepened by a concept or an approach to the solutions, in particular around the right to adequate housing and human rights-based approaches? Thanks.
Thank you so much for your questions and your comments, Maya. So throughout this process, we've definitely learned a lot. One of the key things that we've come to realize is the often siloed approaches between our housing policy and our immigration policy, and how important it is that they are intertwined, especially when it comes to potential systemic barriers to adequate housing. I think I can speak for the team when I say we've learned the most from the civil society organizations that we've interfaced with. They are really doing a lot of the work on the ground and on the forefront of this. And as our engagements have deepened and as they've gone further, our understanding of the IHAP and ILS is that it's truly a reactive approach to what is currently happening across Canada. And what we've seen in civil society organizations, really the provision of wraparound supports. And in our policymaking process, it's not as clear-cut. It's not as easy to have all the line items that it maybe would be for IHAP and ILS, where you can just, audit and easily, it's a very streamlined approach. And perhaps that's why the federal government approached that in the beginning. But now we're seeing really holistically what it takes to provide the right to adequate housing, and it really is those provision of wraparound supports. So in our recommendations across all of them, we wanted to see how we can really develop policy recommendations that are reflective of ensuring that wraparound supports are provided to refugee claimants. They're provided to a certain degree to resettled refugees. They're provided to other priority populations, but there's a fundamental gap. And what we're seeing is that they have improved settlement outcomes if they're provided those supports from the outset. Something as simple as language training or expediting the provision of a work permit can make a substantial difference. In one of our interviews, we were speaking to a civil society organization that said that multiple claimant families tend to rent rooms together, rent apartments together, because they are waiting for their work permit. So again, when it comes to a lot of the xenophobia that we're seeing, there are administrative blockages that prevent claimants from really realizing that right to adequate housing. Thank you.
Okay, folks, questions. Colleen is first. Okay. Weston, do we have anything online? Nothing. Colleen.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I think I can speak for everyone when I say I learned a lot, and you did such a terrific job with such a complex issue. I had a question about your national reception centers. You talked a lot about the xenophobia and anti-newcomer sentiment. You talked a little bit about where those reception centers would be built or located, and I was wondering what your team has thought about in terms of awareness raising and attitude change for communities that will be situated around reception centers.
I think ultimately we have to recognize that people are not coming to Canada. They are fleeing violence, and Canada has prided itself on welcoming immigrants and newcomers. So we need to provide them with, the opportunity to settle successfully so that they can integrate within Canada properly. But on your question on exactly where we would place them, this is why we're starting out with that pilot project. 4 locations, they wouldn't be large scale, as Pallavi mentioned. They would be sort of lower size to ensure that they had the adequate service, the wraparound supports, proper nutrition, the services available, psychosocial services, for example. And then awareness campaigns, it wouldn't necessarily have a big sign to say this is a refugee center. So we would want to make sure that the community is obviously consulted on it, and that ultimately the way that it is built is with consultation with the community, but also just to get the message out there that these are eventually going to be Canadians. According to the Immigration Refugee Board of Canada, 72% of claims were accepted and approved. So these are ultimately claimants that become refugees and eventually permanent residents.
Thank you so much to the team for the insightful presentation, and thanks, Maya. I come from Bangladesh, so we know about the refugee crisis. We also have internal migrants who are coming because of the climate change issues that we have right now. My specific question to the team would be around the reception center. We wanted to know more about what are the key takeaways from the Germany example that you have provided, and how can those be implemented within the Canadian context? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Adrita. So when we're doing the research work, we covered 3 countries, Germany, Finland, and France. So coming to Germany, they already have a legislation, a very specific legislation I will call, for refugee claimants, which they call Asylum Seeker Act. And they also have, and within that legislation, they have very clearly, which really I loved about it, is like they clearly delineated the responsibility among all the levels of government, how many weeks the asylum claimant would be, refugee claimant would be staying, after a month, where they will be moving, who will be the responsible party. So those things have been clearly delineated, as earlier also said, that will prevent backsliding, and the people will, the levels of government will take their due responsibility if it's already legislated. But few things which we would not recommend to be implemented in Canada is like they have a restriction of freedom of movement for the refugee claimants. So once they are in a particular province, they can't move till the asylum claims are finalized. So definitely we will not take those key takeaways, but the targeted approach which they had, and they did around somewhere in 90s, this legislation. So this targeted approach is required, and that's why we prefer this kind of approach in Canada too. Thank you.
It's me. Okay, so online, Ray Silvius has a question for you. Are there any lessons to be learned from Canada's Ukrainian response? You've alluded to resources being made available by IRCC towards this end. What would it take to regularize these sorts of supports for the betterment of all displaced peoples arriving in Canada?
Thank you. Thank you, Ray. We had the pleasure of chatting with Ray as a stakeholder for our brief. When it comes to the Ukrainian response, it's incredible to see how resources were able to be mobilized so quickly. And in our report, we referred actually to the evaluation of the Ukrainian response. So we were able to see not only the actions that IRCC did in terms of expediting documentation processing, improving its operational readiness in Europe, in anticipation of more Ukrainian newcomers coming to Canada. So we're seeing that we're able to mobilize, we're able to build that capacity in emergency contexts. And I think that evaluation report will be extremely, extremely helpful when we think of how we want to operationalize it across the board. One thing that really stuck out for us was the fact that the IRCC was able to mobilize income supports for Ukrainian newcomers and also provide certain services. And Ukrainian newcomers, about, I believe, 70% were able to obtain an apartment within their first month here in Canada. So really reflecting on their different housing and resettlement outcomes shows how we can build that kind of capacity here in Canada for other newcomers, especially refugee claimants. Thank you.
We've got to bring this, quick question up here. Quick question, quick answer, and then we go.
Hi. So, great presentation. I just have a question. What do you think should be done to further the progressive realization to adequate housing now that there is disinvestment in social housing?
Thank you very much for that question. The financialization of housing is the fact where housing is now considered as a commodity other than a fundamental human right. Now, what the progressive realization is seeking to do is to realize the right to adequate housing for everyone in Canada here. But then this cannot be done overnight. So the government has to take deliberate steps and then use the maximum available resources to ensure that adequate housing is being provided for everyone, and then prioritizing first those in with the greatest need. Now, looking at our recommendation 1 will now address that basic gap, where we'll build reception centers for these refugee claimants upon their arrival. We know that cannot be achieved overnight. So recommendation 2 is also there to further enhance the capability or capacity of those already doing it, especially the civil society organization and emergency shelters available for these refugee claimants. So recommendation 2 will now be in place as the national reception centers are being developed. Thank you.
Okay, folks. Team, thank you very much.
Back at 1 p.m.